I want to welcome you to this afternoon. We have a word of greeting that the family would like to bring today, and then I'll introduce our speaker. Those of you that are online with us, hope you can hear and hope everything's working, and it'll be available later for anybody that catches us after today. But
Hello, I'm Karen Nurani, the oldest daughter of Gloria and Ernest, and my mom wrote a few comments to say, and I'm gonna let my husband say it because I'm a little bit too emotional. This is my husband, Daniel Nurani.
Hello. Quite a few of you have known Gloria and Ernest, so you will understand that Gloria always plans well ahead. So she planned this 3.5 years ago as his Ernest's 90th birthday celebration. And so she started 1.5 years early, and then because of COVID, he's now 92, but we're here to celebrate his 90th. And I think Gloria knew what the weather was going to be like, because she starts off with, it isn't so much waiting for the storm to pass as it is learning to dance in the rain. So that's her opening remark. She would like to thank Pastor Ann and Pastor Jeff, because they deserve a big thanks for their willingness to try something like this lecture, and Judy McFarland for her enthusiasm and about making it a celebration. But it is really about St. John's membership, the church. We celebrated Ernest's accomplishments at the Bella Vista United Methodist Church in Arkansas the year of his 90th. With his artwork, his woodworking skills, and his photography accomplishments, but remembering his growth as a follower of the Christ and his lead in teaching others of the scholarly writings of the Bible through times that were good and bad, this belongs to St. John's United Methodist Church. This is where Ernest and I, and this is from her, as a newly wedded couple, found a church home as we came from 2 different church backgrounds. Dr. Fred Ackman was the new minister at St. John's. We were welcomed and put to work. Our children, Karen, Cynthia, Cornelia, were nurtured in their growth as Christians. Our association with the Davenport family Y gave them a sense of international community. And though they were blessed with a sense of self-worth, their church taught a strong sense of social concern and the dignity of each human being. Ernest was given leadership positions that help him lead committees and become a fine lay biblical scholar while teaching the M&M Sunday school class. You may want to say something about the M&M Sunday school class?
It was just Mr. and Mrs.
Mr. and Mrs. Sunday school class. I don't know whether it's still there. No? Okay. Well, Gloria and Ernest will have to come back and reinstitute that. St. John's was always looking for a way to serve the neighborhood, whether a close neighborhood or a faraway one. Diverse neighborhoods with different people from different backgrounds. Because of this, our children have a strong sense of family and to the concept of the other. I want to say thank you, St. John's, and happy birthday, Ernest. I am grateful you were born. And this is from Gloria Febro-Grilk. Thank you very much for being here.
this was one of the first requests I got as a new pastor, can you help make this happen? And so we are glad that today is finally today, and Gloria and Ernest, I was hoping to get to actually meet you face to face, but you get to see me, I guess. So at this time, let's welcome our presenter, Dr. Matthew Schlimm, who's going to come and share with us this afternoon, and it's all yours.
All right, well, thank you very much for being here on a cold and rainy day. I really appreciate you coming out for that, and I really appreciate this invitation. It means a lot to me. I teach the Old Testament at the University of Dubuque Theological Seminary. I've been there since 2008, and while I've been there, I've published a few books. My first one looks at the theme of anger in the book of Genesis. Anger is sort of this interesting emotion because on the one hand, it usually arises from a sense of what's right and what's wrong. And so people usually get angry at injustices, things that are not right in the world. And yet, when we feel angry, it can sometimes get us into trouble when we act on it. So my first book looks at how Genesis treats that. I have another book called The Strange and Sacred Scripture that looks at how some of the questions that naturally come when we read the Old Testament. Why is it so violent? What do we do if one passage doesn't seem to align too well with another passage? How do we make sense of things like that? Why does God sometimes get angry? And then the most recent book I have is called 70 Hebrew Words Every Christian Should Know. And I wrote this book as a way of helping people understand texts in new ways, a way of cracking some passages wide open. One of my mentors said to me that, and she was quoting a rabbi when she said this, she said, if you read a passage of the Bible 100 times, and then on the 101st time, you read it and you see something new, you're reading well. And that stuck with me, and my hope is that this book provides some ways to get those 101st insights. It's interesting, the Bible was actually not originally written in English. English is not God's first language. Instead, the Bible comes to us in 3 different languages. The most common is Hebrew. It makes up almost the entirety of the Old Testament. There's a couple chapters here and there that are in a related language called Aramaic. Aramaic and Hebrew are similar. It's similar to the way that Spanish and Portuguese are very similar languages. And then the New Testament is written in Greek. And we have excellent Bible translations. I've helped out with some translation projects right now. My current project is a commentary on Genesis that I'm writing, and so I'm translating that text. But it's interesting, as you're reading, sometimes there are certain things that you spot in the Hebrew that just is really difficult to convey in the English. Sometimes there's more going on. And so what I'd like to do today is talk to you about some of the things I explore in my book about Hebrew words, talk to you about some of the things that are taking place in different passages, certain words that you can learn from Hebrew that really shed new light on passages. So we'll talk about 7 different things that can get lost in translation. Now, obviously, one of the most common things that gets lost in translation would be the sound of words. So you've got how the Hebrew word sounds and what it means that goes along with it. And of course, when we're translating, we almost always focus on the meaning and not the sound. And a lot of times that's just fine. The Hebrew word for tree or wood is eitz. And there's not any real significance to that I can think of. That's just what it's called. But there are some passages in the Bible where the authors are actually playing around with the sounds of different words. And sometimes paying attention to those word plays can help us understand things more deeply. So if we look already in the 2nd chapter of the Bible, we read in Genesis 2, verse 7, the Lord God formed the human from the topsoil of the fertile land and blew life's breath into his nostrils. The human came to life. Okay? That seems pretty straightforward, but what you might not know, or at least need to look at some footnotes to figure out, is that there's a word play going on here. So the normal Hebrew word for human is Adam. In fact, that's how we get the name Adam. Okay? Adam means human. And the word for soil or fertile land is Adamah. So you can hear there's a similarity, right, between Adam and Adamah. And here in this verse, it's saying God formed the Adam from the Adamah. And the idea is then that we're related to the soil. And I think that changes some ways that we think about it. Dirt is not just something that makes us dirty or that gets muddy when it's raining like today, but rather it's a part of who we are, and God entrusts care for the earth to us. I think a lot of farmers understand that and get that, but sometimes it can be lost in, nowadays with some of the technological things that have taken place. So that's one example of how we've lost the sound from the Hebrew, but it's actually pretty significant right there. There's also a passage in Isaiah chapter 5. The prophet Isaiah tells a parable. When Jesus told parables, he did not invent them. There were other people who told parables. And Jesus tells a parable of a vineyard. And Jesus says there was this person who made a perfect vineyard. There was great soil. Everything was planted just the way it should be. There was a wall constructed around, a fence constructed around, so animals couldn't get in and eat the grapes. Everything was happening just like it should. And yet, when people finally bit into the grapes, they didn't taste it all the way they were supposed to. I don't know if you're like me, at least up in Dubuque, sometimes I buy some produce and it looks like it's going to be so good, and then I get home and it's a letdown. The grapes taste mushy, or hiding behind the label, there's something fuzzy that shouldn't be there, things like that. It's that sort of letdown that takes place. Well, in this parable, God says that the way Israel has been acting is kind of like this vineyard. God has done everything to take good care of Israel, and yet time and again Israel has sinned and gone away from God over and over again. And Israel was supposed to turn out wonderfully and be this light to the nations, but instead is turning out like every other nation. And at the end of this parable, the prophet says God expected, I hit the wrong button there. Here we go. God expected justice, but saw bloodshed, righteousness, but heard a cry. Now, this is a great translation in terms of the meaning of the Hebrew words. It's exactly right. But what you might not know is that there's a key wordplay that's taking place here. So when the prophet says at the beginning, God expected justice, the word there is mishpat, but then it says, but God saw bloodshed, and the word for that is mispach. Okay, so you've got this play on mishpat, justice. That's what Israel was supposed to embody, but instead, violence, mispach. It's so close to what you think it's going to be, and yet it's a letdown, kind of like those grapes that are nauseating. God expected righteousness, the Hebrew word is tzedakah, but heard a cry, se'aka. So tzedakah, righteousness, means innocence. You've got everything going well. You're living a life of integrity. And then the word for cry there is the type of cry that, like, today we would say you're crying bloody murder. The type of cry that is only uttered when somebody is, encounters a crime or something awful. That's the kind of cry It's not just like a single tear, but something awful. And so you can see there's this play on words that we sometimes we miss out on if we don't pay attention to some of the things that are going on there with the text, with the original language. I'll give you one last example. And this one you might have heard before. This one shows up in the lectionary. In the book of Amos, the prophet is, we read this in the 8th chapter. God says to Amos, "Amos, what do you see?" I, meaning Amos, said, "A basket of summer fruit." Then the Lord said to me, "The end has come upon my people Israel, and I will never again forgive them. On that day the people will wail the temple songs, says the Lord God. There will be many corpses thrown about everywhere. Silence." Okay, how on earth do we get from a basket of summer fruit, which is a wonderful thing for us, right? We sometimes at Christmas will even, send people or receive as a gift a nice basket of fruit. It's a great gesture. How do you get from a basket of fruit to all of this horrible stuff that then is described? What's the connection that could be taking place there? Well, in English, it doesn't make any sense. But in the Hebrew, the word for summer fruit is kayetz, and then the word for end is kates. And the word end there doesn't just mean like, okay, you've crossed the finish line, but it's a word that carries a lot of really negative connotations. So when God talks about sending the flood in Genesis 6, God talks and uses this word, the end of humankind, the end of all flesh has come. Okay? And so, whereas we think of summer fruit being a very positive thing, in Hebrew it has this connection with this word that means the end and that can also have very negative connotations. In fact, archaeologists have found one of the oldest inscriptions we have in Hebrew is actually a calendar. It's an agricultural calendar, and it goes through and it says like a month for planting, a month for growing, so many months for harvest, and it goes through the whole year. And the last word in that inscription that we found, it dates to about the year 900 before Jesus. The last word is the word summer fruit. It fits, right? Because it's the end. And so there are those things that are sometimes going on that we can miss. And sometimes these Hebrew words shed certain lights on passages. All right, well, I told you I'd give you 7 different things that get lost in translation. So the first thing is sound can get lost. We've sort of tackled that. But that's not the only thing. Sometimes, not a lot, but sometimes when translators are working with the Bible, they actually will convey the sound, but then the meaning of words will get lost. And this happens most often with names. Almost always when we're talking about biblical names, we learn what those names sound like. But we rarely learn what those names actually mean, even if they're really common everyday Hebrew words. Okay? And so this takes place a fair amount, and sometimes the sounds even go through some transformation because Hebrew was originally translated into Greek, and then that was translated into Latin, and then we get our English translations were built upon these previous Latin and Greek translations. So sometimes it's like this, almost like a game of telephone, right? Where somebody says one thing to the next person, passes it on, and something gets lost. Well, let's take a look here. One example of this comes to us already in the first few chapters of the Bible. So I mentioned to you already that Adam, or the Hebrew word Adam, that's your normal, ordinary, everyday word for humanity. And then the Hebrew word for Eve, chayva, means life. And what's interesting is if you keep looking at the story, you see there are other things other names that have special significance as well. And so it took place in the Garden of Eden. That's where they lived. Well, Eden is a Hebrew word that means delight and pleasure. And then they have 2 sons, and the name of the first son is Cain. Well, Cain in Hebrew means spear. Okay? And think about it. He's the first person to ever commit murder, and his name is Spear. And then his brother, Abel, in Hebrew the word is Hevel. His name means puff of air, fleeting breath. It's like on a cold day, which we're starting to get more of now with the autumn, where you can see your breath for a second and then it's gone. And so you take a look at what all of these names mean together, and you start to realize this is a story about all of us. This isn't just a story about the first people ever. This is a story about you and me. They're describing humanity. The story is describing life and the tragedies that can occur. And you've got this boy named Spear who kills his brother named, Fleeting Breath while they're outside the Garden of Delight. It invites us to really see this story as our own story, the story of our own lives, and not just people in the distant past. I'll give you 2 other examples of this sort of thing, where we have the Hebrew sounds, but we lose the meaning. So in Genesis chapter 11, we have the story of the Tower of Babel. And that's the way it was always taught to me growing up, is the Tower of Babel. But it turns out that Babel does capture the Hebrew sound. The Hebrew word is Bavel. But the interesting thing is that that's the ordinary, everyday word for Babylon. And when it talks about the valley where this tower was built, it's describing Babylon. And Babylon was an important figure, an important empire in the Bible. It was Babylon that conquered Jerusalem after many, many kings. And so you've got this downfall of Jerusalem, and then the Babylonians force the people of Jerusalem to go into exile and scatter them across the world. Well, it's interesting. In this story, it's all reversed. The Babylonians receive God's judgment. It's the Babylonians who are scattered at the end of that story. And so there's a sense in which this story is conveying that those who harm the people of God will one day have their just deserts. God is a God of justice who opposes evil, and God is at work in the world. Another example where the meaning can be lost, and again, this is another name, we've got the prophet known as Jonah. Now, Jonah comes from the Hebrew word Yonah, and Yonah is your ordinary Hebrew word for dove. And so when Noah sends out a dove from the ark, he sends out a Yonah, a Jonah. Okay? Now it's interesting. So you've got this character in this book of the prophets, and God says, I want you to go to Nineveh, and I want you to preach a word to them. And what does he do? He flies away. He tries to get away from God. Just like if you're approaching a bird, the bird's probably going to fly away as well. Another thing that's interesting is that in the book of Hosea, Israel is called God's dove. And so the story, because of that connection with Israel, it invites a comparison. It makes us wonder, well, okay, this is a story about Jonah, but maybe it's also a story about Israel as a whole. Maybe it's a story about all of us. All right, let me just pause there for a second. Any questions so far about the things that I've gone over? Okay, well then let's take a look at a third example of something that can get lost in translation. Sometimes you've got a single word in Hebrew, and there just isn't a perfect English equivalent. When I was a boy, I would, get those cereal boxes, and it would have like some sort of riddle on the back, where there would be a code, and that such and such a number would represent such and such a letter. And I just needed to replace them all, and then the message would become clear, what was, going on there. And I sort of thought that's how languages would work. You'd just grab one word and replace it with another word from another language, and you'd be all set. But sometimes there are words in another language that there's not a perfect equivalent for. And so one of my friends is from Korea, and she said that there's a word in Korean that describes the sadness that people feel in the fall when they see life around them dying and days growing shorter. And when she said that, I thought, boy, I felt that too. I've never really had a word for it. I mean, we have seasonal affective disorder, but I'm not sure that that's quite the same thing necessarily as what we sometimes feel this time of year. And so it just struck me that's an example where there's not a precise English equivalent. Well, we have those sorts of things in the Bible as well. And so let me show you one example of this one. There's a Hebrew word called bara. Let's all say bara. Bara. Okay? So bara means to create. It's your basic verb to create. But the interesting thing about this word is God is the only person who's ever the subject of this verb in Hebrew. So when the Bible is talking about God creating, and it uses this word, it's talking about creating in a way that only God can create. There are other words that can apply to both humans and God. Both humans and God build things in the Bible. They both make things in the Bible. They both form things in the Bible. But when it comes to the word create, only God can create. And there are some passages where that really matters. So the book of Isaiah, especially from about chapter 40 on, it addresses people who are in the land of Babylon, which I mentioned earlier. And in the land of Babylon, they're a minority. And the dominant culture worships a whole bunch of different gods. And if you wanted to fit in with that culture, you would worship the multiple gods of the Babylonians. But what Isaiah does is it says, no, be true to who you are. Don't give up your faith. And it goes on for chapters talking about how basically the foolishness of worshiping other gods, worshiping these idols. It talks about how a woodworker will take a block of wood, and with part of that, maybe he'll form a bench to sit on. With part of that, he'll use some wood for a fire to warm himself, and then with part of it, he'll make an idol to worship. And the idea is that there's an element of foolishness here. Well, it's in that context that we read this in Isaiah 45. We read, "For this is what the Lord said, who created the heavens." And when it uses the word create there, it's the idea that only God can create. Only the one true God makes things in this way. This is what the Lord said, who created the heavens, who is God, who formed the earth and made it, who established it, who didn't create it a wasteland, but formed it as a habitation. I, the Lord, and none other. So you can see how that would fit in very nicely with what's all gone on before about the foolishness of worshiping other gods, and then this emphasis on God who alone can create is the one who's responsible for everything. Okay, a fourth thing that can get lost in translation would be words that have more than one meaning. So we've all done this. We've all looked up words in dictionaries and we've said, oh, okay, there's several definitions to this word. And they don't always fit, especially well together. But sometimes there's more than one meaning at work with a given word. Well, the thing is that when translators are working with the Hebrew text, they've got to pick a meaning. One thing my students love to do in Hebrew class is they love to translate a word, but they'll write one definition and then they'll have a slash and then they'll have another definition after it. And I try to explain to them, it's good that you know that there's both definitions at work, but people wouldn't want a Bible necessarily where it was hard to read, where they had to always pick out which definition was going on. The thing is, though, that there are times when it's really helpful to know what the multiple definitions of words. And so one example of that would be this word. It's pronounced Shema. Let's all say Shema. And that word can mean both hear and obey. It can mean both hear and obey. And so sometimes when people in Hebrew are saying, listen up, sometimes they're also saying, obey what I'm about to say. And you would figure that out on the basis of who's speaking and the context of what they're saying. But it's interesting, there's a very famous passage of the Bible called the Shema, where you've got instead of that first A, you have an E, and that's the command form, listen or hear. And let's take a look at this passage here. I realize it's small on the screen there, but I'll read it for you. Now this is the commandment, the statutes and the ordinances that the Lord your God charged me to teach you, to observe in the land that you're about to cross into and occupy, so that you and your children and your children's children may fear the Lord your God all the days of your life. Keep all his decrees and commandments that I am commanding you, so that your days may be long. And then the very next word is this word Shema, and it's in the command form Shema, and it's saying, hear, listen up, but think about everything that's just happened. We've had a reference to commands, to statutes, to ordinances, to observing, to decrees, to commandments, commanding. There's a sense in which it's also saying obey. Obey, O Israel, and observe them, these commandments, diligently, so it may go well for you, and so that you may multiply greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has promised you. And then this next verse is very famous, and it's almost always translated, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. It could also be translated, Obey, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord alone. And you can see how that makes sense with the context, because the very next verse is what Jesus names as being the number one most important commandment of all. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. So there's more than one thing going on here. This word on the one hand is grabbing attention, saying listen up, but on the other hand, it's also conveying to people obey. There's something important in these teachings that you're listening to. Another Hebrew word with more than one definition is the Hebrew word ra. So let's say ra. Okay. So ra can mean both evil, as in wickedness, sin, iniquity, but it can also mean disaster, as in the bad things that happen in life. And the difficulty with this is that a lot of times translators have to capture one sense of this word, and when really both meanings can be at play. So just to give you a couple examples of that, here in Jeremiah, Jeremiah loves playing around with this word. He says, and this is God speaking, your wickedness or your ra will punish you. It's almost like there's a sense of karma even in the Bible. The idea, you reap what you sow. If you're doing things that are evil, then disaster is going to come your way. You won't be able to get away with it forever. God has established a moral universe. And on the one hand, we live in a fallen world, but in another hand, it still has the fingerprints of God. And when we do things that are destructive, that are harmful, that hurt other people, that hurt God's world, eventually it's going to catch up with us. And so there's a sense in which it says your wickedness will punish you, but it's also the idea is the disaster that you're creating by your wickedness will come back to haunt you in one way or another. Or later on in Jeremiah, God says, now if that nation turns from its evil, from its ra, I will change my mind about the disaster that I intended to bring on it. Now, in the original Hebrew, the same word is behind evil and disaster. And you might miss that if you were just reading along in English. But the idea is that the things that we do here on earth are not just neutral. They have implications for ourselves and for people around us well into the future. All right. Well, a fifth way that we have things lost in translation is that sometimes in Hebrew, the Bible in general loves using metaphors. It loves talking about one thing in terms of another. And Hebrew tends to be very vivid, very concrete. I like that. I'm not a great abstract thinker, but if I can imagine it, then I can pay attention and run with it. And sometimes in translation, all that's conveyed is the abstract idea. We lose the concrete image that goes with it. So one example of this would be, it involves the word to lift, nasa. Let's all say nasa. So it sounds a little bit like NASA, and I tell my students to remember that because with NASA you have liftoff, and the word literally means to lift or to carry something. In Hebrew, this idea of lifting is often how forgiveness is conveyed. When you forgive someone, you are lifting the burden of sin off of them. You're being willing to carry that burden yourself. And that's something that oftentimes, there's entire books that have been written on what does it mean to forgive and how do you do it, and those are important. But I don't want to miss that there's something very concrete here, that the idea is that sin is this burden that weighs us down. And that when we seek God's forgiveness, we're asking God to lift that burden off of us. So you see this in the Psalms. So in Psalm 38, verse 4, the person who's praying says, "For my iniquities have gone over my head. They weigh like a burden." And that word for burden is related to this word nasa. It's too heavy for me. And then in chapter 25, we read, "Consider my affliction and my trouble, and forgive all my sins." In other words, lift these sins up off of me. Another example you might remember that when Cain, after he kills his brother, God confronts him. And one of the things he says after he says, am I my brother's keeper? God calls him out on that, says there's going to be consequences for what you've done. And Cain says, "My iniquity is too heavy for me. This thing that my sin has created is weighing down too much on me to bear." And so it's a very concrete way to think about sin. And I think that sometimes we we get too heady with our theology and we forget some of the real concrete images that are in play. Another one that we talked about a little bit earlier is there's this word hevel, which is used to describe Cain's brother, Abel, and it means a fleeting breath. It's not the life-giving breath that God breathes into people at creation. This is the sort of puff of air that's there 1 second and then it's gone. And what's interesting is there's this really weird book of the Bible called Ecclesiastes. It's unusual. It has sort of a very different message than a lot of what people sometimes like to say. It's not a happy-go-lucky book. Okay? And so, for example, it says in the second verse of it already, vanity of vanities, says the teacher. That's the person speaking in this book. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Okay, so if you look at that, you might be thinking, okay, so it's saying like everything we do is just in vain, okay? But again, vanity is not a word that we use all the time, and it is a little bit more abstract. What the Hebrew is literally saying there is air puff of air puffs. Air puff of air puffs. Everything is a puff of air. And then as you read the book, the person speaking goes on and talks about how we labor with our hands. And he says, but our work is just vanity. What he's saying is our work is just like a puff of air. There are things that we work hard at, and sometimes it just fades away. Sometimes it just has a momentary value. A good summary of the book is found in chapter 2, verse 11. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had spent in doing it. And again, all was vanity and a chasing after the wind. Again, a much more concrete translation is all was just a puff of air and chasing after the wind. And you get that connection, right, between the air puff and the chasing the wind type of thing. Ecclesiastes has a different flavor, like I said, than a lot of the Bible. And it's good that it's in our Bibles. There are times when we're not all happy-go-lucky ourselves, and it's a good reminder. Towards the end of the book, there's this really interesting passage where it talks about the end of life, and it just is really gripping, and it sort of is the culmination of saying everything is this puff of air. It passes, it fades away. All right, another thing that sometimes is lost in translation is you'll have a word that has a lot of impact and power and is used by people all the time in biblical times. But then it gets replaced by a word that hardly anyone uses nowadays. And this is because translators, when they're doing their work, they tend to look at previous translations. They want to make sure that they're not getting too far out there, that they're not missing anything, and so they naturally check what other translations have done. And that's good, but sometimes that habit has led to us incorporating certain words in our translations that are becoming more and more obsolete. So let's talk about this word. It's pronounced hine. Let's repeat that, hine. So hine is usually translated behold. But few of us, when we're talking with our friends, say behold. It just is not a word we use a whole lot every day anymore. But we do say things like wow, or look at that, or think about this, or Shazam, whoa. There's something to pay attention to here. Listen up. That's the meaning that is conveyed by this word. And this word appears a lot in the Bible. The Bible is exciting, and so it has this attention-grabbing word show up quite a bit. So this is how a number of translations handle Genesis 1:31. You can see on the screen there, the New American Standard Bible just translates the word hine as behold. The NRSV does a little bit better. It uses indeed, which is a word that we've at least, hear in conversations, but maybe not quite as much. The NIV doesn't translate this word at all. But if I were to translate the verse, I would say, God saw all that he had made, and wow, it was supremely good. It's this sort of boom, look at this. This is worth paying attention to. Another thing that can sometimes happen is you might have a word that isn't obsolete, but the intended definition is. So let's look at this word. This is pronounced hitzeal. Could you say hitzeal? Hitzeal. Okay, good. So this is usually translated as deliver. And that makes sense. I mean, we've heard of deliver, especially in this age of COVID and Amazon. More and more people are shopping online, things like that. But usually when we use the word deliver, we're talking about something going from point A to point B, and there's not a whole lot of judgment about whether the package that's being delivered is coming from a good or bad place and going to a good or bad place. The thing with the word hitzeal is the object is always coming from a bad place and always going to a good place. It's always coming from a dangerous place and always going to a safe place. So the delivery, the deliverance that's being envisioned is really a sort of rescue, being saved, okay? So we read in the Psalms, please protect my life, deliver me. Another way of translating that would be, please protect my life, rescue me. Or in Psalm 33, it starts off, but look here, and that word for look here is that hine, behold, wow, and I think look here is a good translation. The Lord's eyes watch all who honor him, all who wait for his faithful love to deliver their lives from death. Okay, you can see where point A is a very bad one. It's talking about imminent death. And keep them alive during a famine. So the idea is of rescue here, not just moving something from one place to another. All right, well, the last thing that is lost in translation, there's different ways of talking about it. So one is you could say that words have these networks of association that go with them. And what one culture thinks about a given word may be very different from what another culture thinks about a given word. Or you could think of it this way. Each word has a dictionary definition as well as a much longer encyclopedia definition. And what happens is a lot of times when you're translating words, you can find a word that lines up in terms of the dictionary definition and make the transfer. But sometimes there are other things that are taking place with words that get lost in translation. These broader encyclopedia definitions get lost. So there's this Hebrew word called bayit. Let's say bayit. So bayit means house. I tell my students to remember that. Like just think of a realtor trying to sell you a house, and the realtor is saying, buy it. That's what it means. Well, naturally, when we read about houses in the Bible, our frame of reference is going to be our own houses. And so we might think of siding, an HVAC system, flooring, maybe a cat or dog, but generally not a whole lot of other animals in the house. And some of those things are true, but a biblical house might have some features that are different than what you would expect. One thing that's interesting is that houses in the Bible would actually, a lot of times archaeologists call them four-room houses, because on the bottom floor, you would walk in and there'd be sort of a general open space, and then you'd usually have, that would count as one room, and then you'd have sort of a room on each side of that and a room in the back, okay? That sounds, nothing too earth-breaking there. But biblical houses would usually then have a second floor above it. And that second floor is where people would usually sleep. And in biblical Israel, people did not have savings accounts. They did not have stocks. They did not have CDs. What they had were animals. And your animals were very precious to you and very costly. And so if you have all of your life savings tied up in your animals, you're going to want them to stay safe while you're sleeping. And so what people would do is they would actually take their animals into their houses with them, and the animals would live on the first floor of the house, and then the people would sleep above them. It can get very cold in Israel at night in the desert. And what these animals did is they were sort of like furry furnaces. Heat would come off of them, it would rise, and it would warm up people sleeping on the upper level. Okay? So that's what was going on with houses in the biblical world. And sometimes you read certain texts, and it's really good to keep those things in mind. So there's this really bizarre passage in the book of Judges. Judges was written before there were kings in Israel, and one of its points is to show how everything went off the tracks when there were no kings in Israel. And there's this really peculiar story where there's this guy fighting this battle named Jephthah. And he makes a promise to God. He says, God, if you let me win, I will sacrifice whatever comes out of my house when I return home. Okay? Now, it's not so weird that he makes a promise if God does something. People today still do that. But he goes home, and his daughter comes out of his house. And then he goes and sacrifices her. Even though there are lots of laws explaining this is not something you should do. But as you read the story, it's really weird when you're reading it as English readers because you're like, well, who did he expect to come out of the house? Well, if you keep in mind that in ancient Israel, they had animals on the first floor, then the story makes much more sense. He was saying, that's how people would oftentimes worship God. They'd have barbecues. They would sacrifice an animal, give the best parts to God, let it be burned up, things like that. One final example I'll close with is the word love. A lot of times in our culture today, love is associated with infatuation. All the fun feelings that you feel when you're first falling in love. The problem, though, is that those are difficult to sustain forever. And when the Bible talks about love, it's less interested in that kind of love as, great feelings of infatuation, and it's much more interested in the idea of love being loyalty. Loyalty is what God's love is ultimately all about. That God wants to stick with us no matter what. Even when we get it wrong, even when we find ourselves in horrible situations. And so we have passages like this one where God appears in front of Moses. And we expect to learn what God looks like physically, but instead we get a sort of a description of God's key characteristics. And I just want to point out that 2 times in this passage, God is described as having this loyal love called chesed. Chesed is love that doesn't go away. It's loyalty, it's commitment. Or another passage we have in Isaiah, in a surge of anger, I hid my face from you for a moment, but with everlasting kindness, and that's the word for loyalty there, chesed, with everlasting love, I will have compassion on you, says the Lord, your Redeemer. Amen? All right. Well, I think we have time now for questions, if anybody has any. And I think Jeff has a microphone.
have a mic just so anybody joining us later or those online can also hear. Does anybody have a question they'd like to? Sure.
You know, you described the meaning of the word Adam and the meaning of the word Eve and the sons' names and stuff. Is this part of the argument people have of literal meaning versus figurative meaning of what's said in the Bible?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think that it's an important part of evidence that oftentimes is overlooked with those debates. I think that sometimes the question gets framed in terms of like, did the story of Adam and Eve, historically happen? And if it doesn't align with science, then it's just fiction and we can sweep it aside. What these names suggest to me is that regardless of what you believe about science and regardless of how historical you see these people, their story is reflected in all of our lives. And that we as Christians can still have, deep appreciation for this story. And it can still guide us and guide our faith, regardless of where our positions happen to fall on in terms of science. So yeah, it's I think directly relevant, and I think it's sort of a key part of the conversation that oftentimes gets missed. So yeah, good question.
Anybody else have? Bill.
Hi, I'm curious how pervasive this type of thing is through the Old Testament. How much are we missing by not knowing this sort of thing?
That's a good question. It really depends from passage to passage, and so I mean things like missing sounds. When there's a word play, you'll get that a lot in poetry, and so things like the Psalms and Proverbs have a lot of wordplay where that missing that sound is significant. Whereas, a book like First and Second Kings or First and Second Chronicles that's not going to matter as much there. It is surprising that with names that we don't do more to explain what the names in the Bible mean. Because sometimes I think people were just named that, but sometimes I think that they're even if that's the case, their names still have let us see new light on the story. So, for example, there was a ruler over Israel who was a woman before they had kings, and her name was Deborah, and she was a judge. Well, Deborah comes from the Hebrew word Devorah, which means bumblebee. And you think about it, a bumblebee you might not think of as, necessarily being incredibly powerful, but looks can be deceptive. If you get stung by a bee, you're certainly going to notice it and feel it and, things like that. And I wonder if Deborah was somewhat like that. In the culture of the time, there were not a lot of women who were leaders. People might discount her on that account. And yet she was this incredibly powerful leader that Israel had. So I think there certainly are times when stuff is going on. Now, having that we just missed, but having said all of that, one thing maybe I should have even said at the beginning is the basic message of the Bible can be conveyed in any language, and we're not missing out on that. The fundamentals are clear. There are religions that say, no, you can't translate our sacred texts. And Christians have always said, no, it's okay to translate them. And the fundamentals are there. But I think that in terms of, digging deeper, we can sometimes see more by paying attention to these sorts of things. Yeah, sure.
It maybe be interesting to think about every culture kind of would benefit to go back to the Hebrew. Every language, that's kind of what you're saying. And we're just doing this exercise in English because that's our main language. But when you began and said God's first language was not English. Sometimes we think, King James was the first Bible, and yet the King James translation is built upon all those others.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Anyone else? We have him here, and so we can. So next Sunday when you ask me a question, like Matt,
Just put me on speed dial.
he was here. I have his number if you want to do that. I'd just like to ask a short question. One of your chapters talked a little bit about the word Sabbath, and sometimes I get the question, is the Sabbath, the fourth commandment, one of those things that kind of goes away? You don't ever talk about it. Is that still something that's relevant?
Yeah, that's a good question. We talk about Sabbaths, as a way of referring to a day of rest. And the Hebrew word Shabbat means literally just to stop. Okay? And it's funny, as a seminary professor, I read a lot of things that people write, and sometimes people like to, especially academics, right? We like to just, make things more complicated than they need to be. And on top of that, I love giving people assignments. And so sometimes I think when academics write about the Sabbath or the day of rest, they say, well, you should do all these different things on the Sabbath. And at the heart, the word just means stop. It doesn't even necessarily mean go to church. I think it's good that we do. My wife is a United Methodist pastor. I'm an ordained United Methodist pastor.
Help me out here.
Yeah. But I think that sometimes in our culture, we get so caught up in filling up our lists of things to do and filling up every minute. Sometimes we don't just stop and just exist and let ourselves heal. Christians have really differed in how they interpret the Sabbath, and there's a lot of different takes. Some people say, I try to take a Sabbath each day, where I have a period of my day where I don't work and I devote that to God. It was interesting, when I was growing up, I tried to keep the Sabbath by not doing homework. And of course, not cleaning my room or anything else, right? But I had some friends. I grew up in Western Michigan, and the Christian Reformed Church and the CRC, the Christian Reformed Church and the Reformed Church of America are very popular there. And their take on the Sabbath was, it's perfectly fine to just be sitting there and reading or doing homework, but you shouldn't engage your body in anything physically. And so I would call up my friends and I would say, hey, do you want to shoot some hoops on a Sunday afternoon? And they'd say, no, I can't because it's the Sabbath. And I'd say, oh, okay, well, what are you doing? And they'd say, I'm doing homework. So there's a lot of different ways. Sometimes Christians have been quick to say, like, well, we don't observe Jewish holidays. And this goes, more directly to your question. So do we really need to keep a day of rest? I think that given the fact that it's in the Ten Commandments, it's an invitation. To me, it's one of the best commandments to be able to get to observe, because I've been trying to do it for several years now, and I find that if I don't take the time for a Sabbath, once a week, I just get burned out. I can't keep going. Everything becomes a chore, even things that should bring me joy. And so I encourage people to, but, recognizing that there are different Christian perspectives on that. Other questions?
So it's still percolating.
So you can buy my book on Amazon, most online bookstores, Target online, and like Books A Million, Barnes and Nobles. It's all available there. We had a thought late in the game about bringing some books, but I didn't have any or didn't have enough at home to bring them. So sorry about that.
And he said he doesn't really have an author's discount that would translate into a
Yeah, they do
a
give
cheaper
me an
version.
author's discount, but then you have to pay for shipping and handling on the author's discount books, and so that ends up being about the same as Amazon. So I end up buying my books online,
So you're invited to do that if that's an interesting thing. There are 3 of my books going around somewhere. 2 of them are still going around somewhere. And they're certainly welcome. I mean, I have 3 copies if you want to borrow one of mine and look a little deeper. I mean, you kind of touched on, kind of the beginning story of several chapters and just gave us kind of a sampling of your presentation. So, anybody else? I mean, we can certainly.
Does he use this book in teaching? Do you use this book in teaching?
You use this book as you teach.
I do. So I wrote it in part to help my students because my seminary teaches about 1/3 of our students are Methodists and then 2/3 are Presbyterians. And Presbyterians are required to take Hebrew. And a lot of my students were just seeing this as, oh, great, another hoop to jump through, and didn't understand what the payoff was and why it was worth memorizing vocab words and verb paradigms. And so I wrote this book in part to say, hey, look, there really is payoff here. There really are benefits to this. And so I assigned that to my students over the course of a year and then quiz them on different things. So, yeah.
I think there were 2 important lessons in your talk. One was that most of the religions we practice were received in a different language. And so it is important to understand that language and the background of that language. And the other was that when you do translate it in the living language that you and I speak rather than an archaic form of that language.
Mm-hmm.
And, I can relate to it because I come from the Indian subcontinent.
Mm.
And 2 things happened. One is there was a great migration from Persia into India. And so there is that love for Persian in India, and a lot of people study Persian, but it's the classical Persian that came with them when they came 1,000 years ago. And the Persian that's spoken in Iran is a living version of the language. And so if that person who's speaks classical Persian tries to speak with somebody in Iran today, there is a gap,
Sure, yeah.
And it's the same thing with the Quran. I mean, it came down in Arabic. Well, most Muslims are not Arabs, and that's not their primary language. So when they understand it, it is a translation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important that it be true to the original, yet in the right language, because even Arabic is not the same as it was 1,600 years ago, and it's different from country to country, even in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So I think those two lessons were perhaps the important lessons. One is understand the origin, and 2 is when you translate it into today's everyday language.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for those comments. Absolutely. And it's just fascinating how languages are always evolving. I mean, 400 years ago, people would be using thee and thou. 1,000 years ago, English existed, but we wouldn't recognize it. I mean, there'd be some words that came down in one form or another, but they would be literally using letters we don't even have anymore and stuff like that. So, yeah, thanks.
So why don't we close this segment of our afternoon and just let's express our thanks to Matt. So I'm glad that you were able to come, and I just want to thank those that were here with us this afternoon, and those that are online, and if you're watching other than 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, thanks for catching us when you could. Those that are present, there is a benefit to being here. We have some coffee and refreshments down in the parlor, and the family would like to have a little time to meet with you and greet you following this time. So thank you for coming today. And you may hear a little bit of his book in the future as Pastor Jay and I maybe digest that on our own in little bites. And but again, thank you for coming, and thank you for coming. And let's close with a prayer. Lord God, as we just this morning, we're challenged to go a little deeper in our faith journey, to find a way to learn a little more about your scriptures. We thank you for what was shared with us this afternoon, and just help us to kind of work through some of the details of what we've heard and continue to grow together as your people. And thank you, Lord, for just the words of life that come to us in the book we call the Bible, and just our lifelong journey of seeking to understand it better and to read it well. Amen.